Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session on maximizing memory. So if you have a lot of things to remember, especially if it's reading material, whether you're a student or just in the workplace, and you got to remember a variety of things. And if you ever felt like your memory was terrible, the point of today's session is to help you improve your memory. And we'll even cover a variety of strategies for memorization that can be helpful. So my name is Paul Nowak. I'm the founder and CEO here at Iris Reading. If you're not already familiar with the work that we do, we basically teach study skills, but not just for, the academic level. For a lot of you that are no longer in school, might have just a ton of reading that you got to get done for work or even just personal reading. I'm sure some of you may have a stack of books that you've been wanting to get through but just haven't had the time. And we teach speed reading techniques, comprehension strategies. Of course, we teach memorization. We're going to cover that today. And we do have courses that go into a lot more advanced levels with this. So you always go to our website, click on online courses, and if you want to dive deeper into any of these topics, we also have a course on note taking. And I think all of this really falls under the topic of productivity. We have a course for productivity as well. We want to get more out of our day, plain and simple. So let's get right into it. And first thing I want to mention, we are live streaming. We're actually doing this kind of as an experiment to see which live stream is going to pull the most content, not just for the live, but also for the recording. So if you want to get more access to content, see some of our other videos, or just get weekly updates, which we'll be posting on YouTube, make sure you subscribe right there. We're just at YouTube under the handle Iris Reading. And of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well. My name is Paul Nowak, and we're streaming on, my understanding, we're on YouTube, we're on LinkedIn, and also on Facebook. So streaming live in all these areas. I am keeping an eye on the comments, or if you watch this in the future, we keep track of those as well. If you have any questions, feel free to post them. And if you want to invite us to your company or your school to do a session in person, on site, or even just like a private webinar for your group of students or employees, feel free to reach out to me. My email is just paul@irisreading.com. So let's get right into what we need to cover. If we're going to be efficient readers, there's really, I'd say, 3 big areas that need to be as efficient as possible: speed, comprehension, and retention. We're going to focus mainly over here, but as readers, we want all 3 of these areas to be solid. And I'm drawing a distinction between comprehension and retention because comprehension is what you're understanding the moment you're actually reading that material. So it's like real time, live. Now, that's comprehension. Retention is when you close the book and somebody asks you, hey, what was that about? Or you take a test on it. Now we're relying on our retention or memory of the material. And sometimes your comprehension might be pretty good, but your retention might be terrible. We forget things. So I want to focus on memory today. And if you've taken one of our courses in the past, we discuss what we call the IRIS method, which is an approach you would take to reading material in a comprehensive way. And that is starting with something called an inspection of the material. When I say inspect, it just means get familiar with something before you read it. And how you do this depends on how the material is structured, but generally speaking, if you're reading a chapter, the way you inspect a chapter is you basically just read the parts that pop off the page, starting with the introduction, and then reading the headings and subheadings. Maybe you have some boldface words or words that are in italics. So really, this is just casually flipping through the chapter, looking at headings, subheadings, boldface words. Maybe you have some titles of charts, tables, diagrams. So you're just getting a broad idea of what this is about. You get to the end, you read your conclusion. Notice how all of these things listed here are just general pieces of information: intro, conclusion, headings, and subheadings. This is important because before you read something, it's a good idea to know, what am I getting myself into? And a lot of people, they just read chapters cold. They're like, okay, page 1 of chapter 1, I guess I'll start here. And they read in a very linear way. And I understand if you're reading fiction, then yes, you don't want to spoil the ending. I get that. But when you're reading informational material, nonfiction, it's always a good idea to inspect something or get familiar with it before you read. You can kind of think of this as what do you do before you work out or before you play a sport? You warm up, right? You stretch out. This is like the reading equivalent of warming up, stretching out, so that when it's time to read, now I'm ready to digest that information. And what happens is if you do all this first, what's going to happen to your reading speed? probably going to read a little faster, right? And what about comprehension? Your comprehension is going to be better if you get familiar with the material first. You will comprehend it better. That's just how it goes. Now, if you had a short article, something like this, there's no headings or subheadings here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the highlighted parts. You see, well, I put these highlights there because this is the first sentence of each paragraph. You read all the first sentences because those are usually main ideas or topic sentences, however you want to think about it. If you read all these first sentences first, now you know what the gist of what this is going to be about, and that will give you an edge when you start reading it. You'll have faster speed, better comprehension. This is very straightforward advice to inspect something before you read it, but most people don't do it. Most people, they take an article like this and just read it beginning to end, and then you have to read slow because you don't really know what's coming up. So always inspect what you read, and then you read the material. Inquire, this just means inquire about what you just read. So that means asking questions. Questions help focus the mind. So questions you can ask are things like, I don't know, if I was reading a book just casually, I'd ask, all right, what are the biggest takeaways from what I just read? Or I would ask questions like, if I was a student, I'd be asking, what do I need to memorize? That leads to the storage step here. And store at the end of this process means, okay, what do I need to store? How am I going to memorize it? Now, a lot of people don't necessarily have a strategy for memorization because they haven't learned how to memorize. Think about it. How many times have you been told in school, you know, memorize this, memorize that, don't forget, remember this for the test? How many times have you been told, well, here's how you memorize? So it's kind of like learning how to learn. That's what we're going to cover here. So we all know that one of the most important things when it comes to memory is repetition. Repetition helps you remember. I'll repeat that. Repetition helps you remember. We all know that. I've got some musical imagery here because music is full of repetition. Isn't it true there are songs I could put on right now you have not heard in years, and you know the lyrics to that song because of repetition? When that song was popular, you heard it over and over again, and that's how it got stuck in your head. And of course, music has other things that repeat, right? Like the beat or the melody, the chorus repeats. So repetition is important. And when you're reading, repetition is important, but I don't want to read chapter 5 in this book 4 or 5 times just for the sake of repetition. I want to read chapter 5 one time, and I want to be able to retain it as well as possible. And we need to get our repetitions in other ways. So the way you do that is through this process. You inspect, that's one repetition right there. You read, that's the big one, right? You get all your details now, you're reading for comprehension. That's another repetition or exposure to the information. When you inquire about what you just read, that's another repetition because you're basically reflecting on what did I just read? Asking questions, things like that. And then when you figure out or try to store the information, that's another, again, you're reflecting on how am I going to memorize this? So let's talk about that. There are some very important memory principles that you need to be aware of. And we know repetition is one of them, but there's a few more that you should understand, and we're going to apply in various memory techniques. So one of these very, very important things that impacts your memory is the idea of visualization. And it's just your ability to visualize something without it actually being there. So they sometimes refer to this as the mind's eye. That's why I have this creepy picture with a brain with an eyeball on it. But your mind's eye is just your ability to see something in your mind without it actually being there. Like I can visualize a family member, whether it's my mom or dad or one of my brothers or a close friend. I could visualize what they look like even though they're not necessarily here. Now, your visual recall, that's the reason why you forget someone's name, but you remember their face. This ever happened to you where you immediately forget someone's name? It can be kind of embarrassing. By the way, if you're interested in the topic of remembering names, we actually have a course on that. You can go to the website, irisreading.com, and that's where you can find it. But we all forget names sometimes. That just happens. That's unfortunately, that's been the case for everyone. But you are more likely to remember someone's face. Isn't that true? And that's because a face is visual. A name is abstract. So our visual recall is better than our verbal recall. That's why companies will have not just their name, but also some visual imagery, like a logo. They run ads, lots of visuals attached to their brand. Now, association is another important memory principle. And this is just our ability to associate information from one thing to another. That's how we learn. So it's part of the reason why, you know, if you're in the workplace now, and let's say you're working in an area that you studied while you were in school, doesn't your learning of that subject matter, it increases very, very quickly when you start applying your learning from, like in college, you're getting theory, right? When you start working in the field, that's practical knowledge. So that association now is accelerating your learning. So we're going to use association, visualization, and there's one other thing that you need to utilize if you're going to remember things very well. And this has a deep impact on your memory, very important. It's the idea that you remember things that are weird. Anything that's strange or out of the ordinary is more memorable. That's why at some point in McDonald's history, they decided to use a clown to help them sell cheeseburgers. It doesn't make any sense, but that's okay because we remember things that are weird. When I tell you Geico, what do you think of? The company Geico, they have those commercials with the talking lizard. Doesn't make any sense, but again, same thing with Coca-Cola. I went to the movies recently and I saw some, before they did the trailers, I saw some ads for Coca-Cola where they had polar bears drinking Coke, which doesn't make any sense, right? If you're wondering why polar bears are on the brink of extinction, maybe it's because they're drinking too much Coke. But again, this makes no sense, but advertisers do it because you're more likely to remember something if it's weird. Now, here's how you can start storing information. I want to go over a few different memory techniques. We're going to start with one of them. Let's just make an assumption. Let's say you read through this book, Brain Rules. It's about 300 pages. You see the subtitle, 12 Principles for Surviving and Thriving at Work, Home, and School. Let's say you read this entire book, and now you want to remember, maybe you need to memorize all 12 of these so-called brain rules that you see over here. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, all the way through 12. Maybe you got to memorize them in order. So you see here, exercise, survival, wiring, attention, short and long-term memory, sleep, stress, sensory integration, vision, music, and exploration. Now, at your first exposure to that information right now, I'm sure you can remember some of them, right? But there's 12. Chances are you might remember a few, maybe not all of them. I'd be very impressed if you could remember all 12 just seeing that in the first minute. Now, we could remember it by just repeating, like write it down a bunch or repeat it to yourself over and over again. But there's a better way than just straight up repetition. So let me explain one technique you can use called the numeric peg system. This is a really interesting memory technique because what you do is you take numbers and you peg them to visuals. When I say peg, I mean associate. So basically, to use this system, you just got to memorize 10 visuals. And I love teaching this technique because it's so easy to implement. So here's what you do. Every number has to be visualized in some way. So the number 1 becomes a pencil. Why? Because it has the same shape. Now you don't have to use a pencil. You could use what else is shaped like a 1, like a tie, you know, like a tie. You could just go straight down. So we use 1 as a pencil or a tie, whatever you want, but I use pencil. Number 2 is a swan. Again, you could use another visual if you wanted, but 2 kind of looks like a swan, so I use number 2 as a swan. So what we're doing for 1 through 10, we're replacing the numbers, which are abstract, and converting them to visuals. And it comes in handy. I'll show you how in a few moments. So 3 would be McDonald's. You see how 3 kind of has the same shape as the McDonald's golden arches if you tilt your head this way, right? 3. McDonald's. 4 is a chair. I know some people do their 4s like this. I make my 4s like that, which kind of looks like an upside down chair, so I use a chair. You see the seat here and the backrest. 5 is a hook. See the curvy part of the 5? Curvy part of the hook. Again, it's upside down. The orientation of the objects doesn't matter. You just got to memorize visuals for 1 through 10. And again, I'm giving you the visuals that I use. You can use other visuals if they make more sense to you. 6 for me is a cherry. You see like the cherry here with the stem coming out, cherry. 7 is lightning. You see the 7 right here. 7 right here. There's 7 reminds me of lightning. 8 is a racetrack. Even though it's kind of weird with an intersection here, we just imagine 8 as a racetrack. 9 is a balloon. You see the 9, how it's kind of looks like a balloon with a string attached. 9. And 10 for me is a plate or a bowl and some silverware. And it could be any kind of silverware. It could be a spoon, a fork, chopsticks. Again, this could be a plate or a bowl, but it's a place setting to me. So once you have these 10 images, you can start applying and associating to whatever you need to memorize. So the way you do it is you take a topic. In this case, we have our, let's say this was the example, brain rules. And I know there's 12 here, and we just memorized 10 images. There's an easy way to scale this up. I'll explain that in a few moments. But what you do is you got to associate all the topics, exercise, survival, wiring, and so on, with their respective visuals, pencil, swan, and so on. So let me give you an example. Exercise. You got to think of some visual that reminds you of exercise. For me, it's like going to the gym. And I got to include in this visual that I come up with it in my brain, I got to include pencils in some way associated with exercise. Now, what's very important when you're doing this, when you're visually associating, what's very important is that you exaggerate, okay? Because we remember things that are weird. It's more helpful if you say, okay, like for exercise, I would imagine imagine like a brand new gym opened up in your neighborhood. You go to this gym and everybody's working out with pencils, okay? Somebody on like the bench press with a pencil, someone doing curls with a pencil, another person maybe on the shoulder press with a pencil. So imagine this like weird imagery to help you remember exercise. Same thing with number 2, you got to come up with an image for survival and swan. So the image I would use would be like a swan struggling for survival in that it's drowning. So I'd feel bad for the swan. I'd see it like flapping its wings all over the place. It's drowning. None of this makes sense because swans should have like a default setting of knowing how to swim, but I just picture a swan struggling for survival. I would imagine myself jumping in the lake, trying to save this poor swan. The more elaborate and weird you make these images, the better. And actually, memory researchers have a name for what we're trying to do here. They call it elaborative encoding. So elaborative encoding is just an academic terminology for come up with a weird image and you're more likely to remember it. For McDonald's, okay, that's 3. I got to remember wiring. I'd picture a Big Mac with barbed wire inside of it. And you just keep doing this. Something for attention, associate to the chair. For the hook, you associate that with short-term memory. Hooks remind me of pirates, so I'd be going some pirate route here. And I'm just going to run through the rest of these. We do the same thing with a cherry and long-term memory. Sleep has to get associated with lightning. Stress with a racetrack. Balloon with sensory integration. By the way, if you look at terms, if you ever have issues with how am I going to come up with an image, you got to think, how can I visualize this? Sensory integration, this is all about your 5 senses. So for me, when I think of the 5 senses, I think of a nose, an ear, an eye, a tongue for taste, a hand for your sense of touch. So I would put all 5 of those body parts inside of a very large balloon, and I would just imagine them floating around in this very disturbing, creepy looking balloon with 5 body parts to remind me of the 5 senses. And that's how I could circle back to, oh yeah, sensory integration. 10, vision. Okay, I'd picture a plate or a bowl filled with eyeballs, okay, to remember vision. But you get the idea. And then when you get to 11 and 12, and by the way, here's how this works later. If you got to remember what is number 1, later on, the easiest way to remember it is, oh yeah, 1 is shaped like a pencil, and that reminds me of, oh yeah, the people working out with pencils. Exercise is number 1. So basically, these visuals for the numbers become like your clues to help you remember what the topic was. If you got to go beyond 10, like 11, 12, what if you got to remember 15 or more than 20 things? Let me explain how you do that. And it's not what you might be thinking. Some people think, okay, maybe I'll use 2 pencils, right? Because 1 and 1, or a pencil and a swan. No, don't do that, because that doesn't scale well. If you used a pencil and a swan for 12, what happens when you get to 21? Well, now we got swan and pencil, and this is how you might get your memories crisscrossed. So you don't want to do that. What you do instead is, if you got to scale the system up, you got to create a rule, or you can think of it as a theme that applies to all of the numbers 11 through 20. And that rule could be whatever you want. It's very arbitrary. So the rule that I use is snow. You don't have to use snow. You could use something else like rain. It doesn't have to be rain or weather related. It could be, I don't know, books, cars, celebrities, whatever you want. So we create this rule, and the way it works is when you get to 11, Your image that you come up with in your mind has to associate a pencil, because 11 has a 1 in it. The difference is our visual is now going to have snow involved. It could be a snowstorm, a blizzard, a snowball fight, a snowman, and some imagery related to snow and imagery related to your topic that you need to memorize. So the visual you come up with has to have 3 elements: pencil, snow, and a visual for the topic. Same thing with 12. You're going to reuse the swan. You're going to use some snow-related imagery and some imagery related to the topic. So as you can see, the topics here are music, exploration. I would just say, okay, what is the first thing I think of when I think of music? I think of like a composer, you know that little stick that they use? I think it's called a baton. I think that's the proper name for it. Anyway, you can tell I have no music background, but I think of like a composer with a baton, and I'm going to imagine a composer with a giant pencil instead of like a normal pencil or a normal baton. I picture a big one, and he's maybe composing music in blizzard-like conditions outside. Actually, I think of this outdoor music venue in Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago. I moved to the Miami area about 2 years ago, and Chicago has this amazing venue in Millennium Park where the Chicago Symphony Orchestra actually practices during the spring and summer. So I would imagine like a composer out there with a pencil instead of a normal baton, and I would imagine it's snowing, and imagine all the craziness associated with that. So that's how we might remember 11 being music. 12, we got to use a swan. Snow again, because again, our theme or the rule would be snow, or something else, but you keep your rule consistent. And then, okay, well, what's my topic? Exploration? Okay, how am I going to associate to exploration? Maybe I picture I don't know, I would picture like exploration reminds me of space, so I go the space route. There's a giant swan, swan-shaped spaceship in the snow. It's snowing in outer space. I know it makes no sense. That's okay. And I would picture this imagery. And you just make more rules. If you got to remember more than 20 things or 30 things, every next 10 gets its own theme or rule. The rule I use for 21 through 30 is there's got to be a fight going on. I think you get the idea. And basically, I mean, I hope you never have to remember like 42 different things in a precise order. But if you did, at least you have a system for it. This is much more effective than just writing it down a bunch or repeating it a bunch. They sometimes call that rote memorization, when you just rely on repetition to the extreme. That is rote memorization. Yeah, it's somewhat effective, but I'd say somewhat because it's one of those things that's effective maybe for the short term. It might help you remember things today or for the test tomorrow, but long term, the memories aren't as sticky, okay? Your memories are going to be more sticky if you combine repetition with association, visualization, and exaggeration. That's what we're doing in a system like this. We're associating visuals, like a 1 is now a pencil, a 2 is now a swan. By the way, there are variations of this system where the visuals are not what they look like pencil and 2 being a swan. The visuals are instead like images that are rhyming with the number. So 1 could be a bun, like a piece of bread, a bun. 2 could be a shoe. 3 could be a tree. So you could use any variation like this, but the idea is that you're converting something abstract, numbers, to visual. Remember, you are more likely to remember visual information than abstract information. That's the key here. Now, this is just one technique. Let's go over a couple more. There's another technique that's a few thousand years old. You may have heard of it. The memory palace technique. This is such a great technique for remembering lots and lots of information. It was utilized by the ancient Greeks, and I want to show you how this works because it's very, very effective. You basically take a location you're familiar with, and best practice is to use your home, and then you just create a walkthrough of your home. So you have various locations in your home, and you associate locations to things you got to memorize. So here's an example of how you do your so-called memory palace. All right, you take your home and think of it from the standpoint of, when you get home from work or school, what is location number 1 that you encounter? It could be the front door, the mailbox, the driveway. So you pick a first location, whatever that might be for you. And then, okay, what's location number 2? After that, maybe it's the closet where you put your clothes and your shoes. What about location number 3 and 4? And you just make a walkthrough of your home and you don't repeat a location at all. You got to keep, locations can only be used once. Now, I have 10 locations here. You can have more than 10. How many should you have? Depends on how many things do you have to memorize. So if I have I don't know, if I have to remember 13 things, I'm going to have 13 locations. And then I'll associate those things to each location. I'll give you an example in a moment, but I want you to know you can have another approach to this technique where instead of, like this scenario was, okay, where are you when you get home from work or school? Front door and then the closet. But another approach that you can take is like your morning routine. When you wake up, where are you? Bedroom. Next, maybe you go to your closet, you're getting ready for school or work. What's next after that? And next after that. So now I'm in maybe the kitchen, making myself breakfast. I go to the dining room to eat my breakfast. After that, I'm leaving out the front door and I'm getting in the car or on the bus or on the train. Next could be, I don't know, the first street that you encounter. And then you could continue your memory palace from work or school. Again, you could go beyond 10, but here's how it works. Let me give you an example. Let's say your topic is related to technology. Your memory palace is your home. And I say home because you could have more than one memory palace. You could use your home. You could use your friend's place. You could use grandma's place, whatever you want. But it's best practice to start with your home because that's probably the location you're most familiar with. And you create your memory palace, right? Let's say these are my first 5. I have here and so on, because you can have, 12 or 13 or 21 locations if you want. Let's say the topic in technology is, I don't know, you got to memorize these 10 companies. Maybe it's the top 10 largest tech companies in the US. This is not actually the list. This is an arbitrary list, but let's say this was the list. Apple. You need images for Apple, and you got to associate an image related to Apple with the mailbox or whatever your location 1 is. So you see I've got Apples here, iPhones, that's another thing that reminds me of Apple, or laptops. Honestly, if I was doing this, what I would do, Apple reminds me of the co-founder of Apple, Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, he died, he passed away a number of years ago. I would picture the ghost of Steve Jobs coming out of my mailbox as I open it. And maybe he grants me 3 wishes. So for Amazon, we need something similar. Again, you want to exaggerate these images. So you might picture a giant box from Amazon sitting at your front door, or maybe it's Jeff Bezos, the former CEO, the founder of Amazon. Maybe he's at your front door delivering a box to you from Amazon. Same thing with Facebook. We picture something Facebook related on the stairway. Twitter, that reminds me of blue birds. I'd picture those birds flying around the living room. You get the idea. The cool thing about this technique is actually you can use it to memorize details as well. How do we handle details? Well, if I got to remember 3 things about Twitter, I'm just going to take each detail, I'm going to visualize it in some way, but I'm going to put those visuals in 3 areas of the living room. So what can we use in the living room? You could use your couch, the coffee table, the TV. If you need more locations, you could use the walls. Maybe there's a painting on the wall. You could use windows. You could use the ceiling, the floor, multiple objects that are maybe a lamp. You get the idea. Same thing for, I don't know, if number 6 was the kitchen, well, we've got various areas of the kitchen. So if I got to remember 8 details about topic number 6 and I'm in the kitchen, well, I'm going to put those details in the fridge, in the microwave, the stove, the countertop, the cabinets, the coffee machine, and you keep on going. And the great thing about this technique is you can have more than one memory palace. Again, there's a lot of locations you're familiar with, not just your home, but also where you went to school or where you're currently going to school. You could use your workplace, you could use a family member's place or a friend's place, and that's how we can really expand our ability to remember things. This, to me, is kind of like a mental filing cabinet, the way I think of it. So use the memory palace. It's old, but it's gold. This is a few thousand years old, this particular technique. Now, there's another technique for remembering vocabulary. Sometimes when we're reading, they'll throw around new vocabulary. We got to memorize, or you might be learning a new language and you got to remember the meaning of words. So there's a technique called the similar sound technique, and here's how it works. You basically take a sound you're familiar with and you make an image out of it. So claustrophobia, we'll take this as an example, even though you probably know what this means already. Let's say we were trying to teach this to a young kid that has no clue what this means yet. We take a similar sound in the word, like we could focus here, claus, and claus sounds like Santa Claus. Okay, let's take Santa Claus, and even though it has nothing to do with the fear of closed spaces, we're going to force Santa Claus to get involved. And I would tell this young kid, imagine, it's the night before Christmas, and you hear all of a sudden someone yelling outside. Turns out it's Santa Claus. He's stuck in a chimney, and Santa Claus is terrified of getting stuck in chimneys. So we'd picture something like this for claustrophobia. We just have to remind this kid this is not the fear of Santa Claus. It's the fear of closed spaces. Santa Claus is afraid of closed spaces like tight chimney spaces. Now, let me give you a word you might not be familiar with, balloonphobia. So we focus here. This is actually the fear of needles, by the way, balloonphobia. Now, balloon kind of sounds like balloon to me. Now, it's not the fear of balloons. This is the fear of needles. But the sound, similar sound technique, requires that I'm going to take a sound like balloon and associate it to the fear of needles. Now, you don't have to use a balloon. Another sound I see here is like bologna, like, the lunch meat, bologna, or be alone, like being alone. Any of these images can work, but I would go the balloon route because that's the first thing that popped into mind for me. And I just pictured a giant red balloon afraid of needles coming at it. But I would want to dramatize this in my mind. I picture the red balloon like sweating and yelling for help. Maybe all of this is happening in slow motion and the balloon is like, no, and eventually it gets popped by the needles. The more ridiculous you make these images, the better. Here's another word you might not be familiar with, or you can get it from the prefix maybe. Anthrophobia is the fear of people. Now, you could have got that from the prefix anthro, right? Now, there's all sorts of like prefixes. Like if you studied Latin or Greek, it makes acquiring some of these words a little easier, but I didn't study Latin or Greek. So, I mean, anthro, maybe you didn't come up with that connection. Maybe instead of that, you focus on a similar sound that is just right here, ant. And we could use the insect, or we could use a family member. We got to associate, that's what the plus sign is here for, associate that to the meaning, fear of people. I would picture a bunch of ants afraid of people stepping on them, like a village full of ants, like thousands of them, and they're all running for cover, and human footsteps are just crashing down upon their little ant village. And I would picture all the chaos associated with that. You can do this with other words. Here's a Spanish word for boat. Barco means boat. And first time I saw this word, I was like, okay, I see the sound bar. I see the sound bark. Bark reminds me of like a dog barking. So I'd associate a dog on a boat stranded at sea. Maybe it's barking for help. I mean, we could picture various images. I might picture this dog. You might picture another dog, but I think you get the idea. You got to come up with a visual. It's got to be weird. Maybe this kind of image of a dog in a like cardboard boat, stranded at sea. Okay, here's a German word, Kino, which means movie theater. Okay, well, how are we going to remember this? Well, Kino, to me, it sounds almost like rhino. Kino, rhino. Now, it's not the same sound. It's a similar sound. Remember, this is not the same sound technique. It's the similar sound. So I would picture, okay, I need rhinos involved with a movie theater. I'm going to imagine being in a movie theater. Halfway through the movie, a bunch of rhinos bust through the screen and start chasing people around the movie theater. And I'd picture all the blood and gore associated with that. Okay, so you get the idea. And by the way, I'm Polish, so I will teach you a Polish word. This is the Polish word for house or home. It's pronounced dom, and dom just means house. Now, dom kind of sounds like the English word dome. So picture maybe a dome-shaped house, like a dome around your house, maybe like a snow globe dome. But again, dom means house. Now, this is all part of this storage step. So what I'm getting at here is when you are reading, you're not trying to memorize when you're reading. You're trying to comprehend when you're reading. Memorization can come later, but this is the step where you identify, okay, what do I got to memorize? Do I have to memorize vocabulary or details? And you have a few options now for techniques to memorize, right? We got the numeric peg system using numbers to remember. We got the memory palace using locations to remember. And we got the similar sound technique for memorizing through a similar sound. Any one of these techniques can be helpful depending on what you're trying to remember. Now, as far as note-taking goes, of course, note-taking helps you remember too, but when you're taking notes, you can do it during this process. You inspect the material, jot down some notes. You read while you're reading, you take notes. By the way, if you're looking for ways to take notes, you might be familiar with some of the traditional ways of doing it, but there's a variety of memory and note-taking techniques you can utilize. If you're interested in diving deeper on that topic, go to our website and check out our note-taking course. Again, that's at irisreading.com. And we dive very, very deeply into the topic of note-taking. I'm sure there's some note-taking techniques we cover there you might not be familiar with that you might find very useful. Now, when you're done reading, you inquire, you ask some more questions, maybe you take some more notes or reorganize your notes, and you're trying to store, where am I going to store these notes? And let's think about, even if you take notes, you might forget things, right? How fast do we forget? Well, there's something called the forgetting curve. And it looks like this. You learn something, and you see right here, this is how we forget things very, very quickly if we don't review. Like when they say review, like bringing something back top of mind, that's where you bring it back up. You see retention is on the y-axis over here. This is the time on the bottom. Okay, so when you first learn something, you're going to forget quickly unless you review it, right? Repetition helps us remember things. But even when you review it, you're still going to forget over a period of time. You want to interrupt the forgetting curve by reviewing again and again. And at a certain point, if you review enough, at a certain point, you'll be like, okay, I got this. It's now, I'm no longer forgetting. I've now taken short-term memory and converted it to long-term memory. That's where this is no longer falling and it becomes a straight horizontal line of long-term memory. I got this. So when exactly should you review your notes? If you're trying to remember something really, really well, let's say you got something that you need to know inside out. We can actually take a mathematical approach to remembering information, because initially you got to get your repetitions in quick, but then you could space them out wider and wider. And you can use something called the Fibonacci technique or Fibonacci sequence to help you remember things in a mathematical approach. So here's the Fibonacci sequence. If you're not familiar with it, you see the numbers over here. You can probably guess if you look long enough what the next number is going to be. Basically, to get every additional number, you got to add the previous two numbers. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, and so on. What I want you to notice is the gap between these numbers initially is very small, but the gap starts getting wider and wider. All of a sudden, it starts getting exponentially wider. And you could actually model this to help you remember things. So let me give you an example of like a study plan. That's a mathematical approach to when should I review? And this is only for the scenarios where you need to know something really, really well. Okay, so here's a timeline. Fibonacci numbers are at the top. And then we have a when to review. We're going to make an assumption here. Let's say you read something, you're done reading, or you just attended class and you're done with your lecture at, I don't know, 12 noon. When should we review? Let's assume this is on an hourly scale, and 1 hour later, that's the next Fibonacci number, 1. So 1 hour later at 1 p.m., you're going to review your notes. So let's say I took notes during class, or I took notes based on what I read. I'm going to take my sheet of paper, I'm going to review those notes, or maybe it's a digital sheet of paper. I'm reviewing my notes. Okay, now what? I got to know this maybe for tomorrow's test. When should I review it again? 2 hours later at 3 p.m. Let me space things out a little bit. And then when should I review it again? 3 hours later at 6 p.m. Okay, now when? 5 hours later at 11 p.m. Now, this timing is very convenient because, of course, you got to get some sleep, right? So if you can get 8 hours of sleep, they say that's pretty good. 7 in the morning, I'll review again. Now, I'm not suggesting you do this precisely, but just the general idea. Notice initially you repeat very quickly, but then you can start spacing it out wider and wider. And the Fibonacci numbers just give you kind of like a timeline. You don't have to follow it exactly because, again, I'm not suggesting if these times were different, it would suggest, oh, wake up at 3 in the morning and review your notes. No, you don't have to do that. But before you go to bed, when you wake up, and then if you wanted to keep doing this, you would review again 13 hours later at 8 p.m. Notice now I'm reviewing at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. Why is it spaced out so widely? Because I've already had a few repetitions here, right? So when do you stop doing this? Well, when you're confident enough that you know the information. There's a certain point after a certain amount of repetitions where you're going to think to yourself, like, you know what? I don't have to keep reviewing this because I think I got it down. And that's when you stop these Fibonacci review periods. So this is, of course, interrupting the forgetting curve. Remember, the forgetting curve looks like this. Notice when you're forgetting, you got to review, bring it top of mind, but you can space out your repetitions hourly, or you could even do this on a daily basis. That would be for situations where, okay, hourly, I would do this if I need to know it really well, and I got a test coming up like tomorrow. If I just want to remember the information, casually, I might do a daily, 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, 5 days later. Or you could even do this on a monthly basis. This is what I do when I'm reading books casually. So I've got this book here, On Second Thought, Outsmarting Your Mind's Hardwired Habits. So this is a book I'm currently reading, and when I'm done, I'll have notes based on that book. And then I'm going to review those notes a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later. I do that because I'm not going to be tested on this book. For me, I'm just reading this because I find the topic interesting and I want to remember it long term, but I'm not going to be like grilled on it or tested on it. I just want to have the knowledge and remember it long term. So I do this on a monthly basis. I just set reminders in my Google Calendar, and I have a calendar specifically for books to review my notes. So however you do it, this is basically called spaced repetition. Now let's talk about focus, because when you're trying to remember anything, focus is incredibly important. Actually, remember I told you about at the beginning of the session how it's so easy to forget someone's name. Like sometimes you immediately forget someone's name. And I want you to know that is not always a memory issue. Sometimes that is an attention or focus issue. If I wasn't paying attention when they told me their name, then of course I'm not going to remember it. I remember it. I didn't even receive it to begin with because I wasn't paying attention. And again, if you're interested in how to remember names, go to the website. We've got a course on how to remember names. But the topic of focus is very important. If you are interested in this, there's a great book on the topic, and I have a PDF that I could send to you for free. It's called Focus, A Simplicity Manifesto in the Age of Distraction. The author's given us permission to freely distribute this book as its PDF form. So if you want me to send you that, it's a quick read. It's like 100 pages, but a great book, lots of nice practical advice in there if you're trying to improve your focus. And of course, that will help you with memory as well. So shoot me an email if you're interested in that book. Just let me know you were in the session. And if you want to dive deeper on any of these topics, whether it's speed reading, comprehension, note-taking, or memory, we have courses for all these, including a productivity course. Use this code if you want to get an extra 30% off. It's just my name, Paul, and that will give you an additional discount. Also, be aware we're going to continue posting videos on our YouTube channel related to reading related topics, how to get more efficient with your memory and comprehension, productivity, things like that. So don't forget to subscribe. If you're on the channel right now, give it a like, give it a subscribe if you want weekly updates from the channel. Also, I've got my contact information right here. If you want to invite us to your company or school to do a presentation on any of these topics, we're more than happy to. You could just shoot me an email, paul@irisreading.com. Also, feel free to connect on LinkedIn if you want to connect there, or Instagram. I want to thank everyone for attending today's session. I hope you found it helpful. If you ever have any questions, feel free to get back in touch. But thank you so much for attending today's session, and have a great rest of the week. Take care.